A very brief note before we get started. If you want to read in addition to or instead of listening, you can read episode breakdown of this and other episodes of the series of The Birth of Modern Prosperity at onhumans.substack.com. There's also a link in the show notes. I hope that you enjoyed. This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And the journey continues. The journey to understand the birth of modern prosperity. So this is a 4-part series, small feast of curated highlights from my conversations with some of the world's leading economic historians. And don't worry if you haven't listened to part 1, each of these episodes can stand on their own. But whether you have or have not listened to that, it might be useful to have a quick zooming out of where we are right now. So we all know that humans are richer today than ever before. And some of us rejoice in this, others worry about its impacts on climate, on Earth's limits. I personally do both. But this series is not really about celebrating or worrying. It's about explaining how we got to be where we are. So in part 1, I had Oleg Galor, author of Journey of Humanity, on the show, who explained what he sees as the big arc of humanity's economic history. And the big arc, at least since the dawn of agriculture, is very simple. There are ups, there are downs, but until the 1800s, nothing really changes for the average person. How could this be, you might ask, as technologies sure did get better? Well, Galor says that it happened because improvements in technology, agriculture, etc. led to more humans, not to more prosperous humans. Humans became better at getting grain from a single patch of land, but so we had more and more humans living from that single patch of land. So this is the so-called Malthusian trap. Now, my guest in episode 3, Daron Acemoglu, will push back against this Malthusian thinking, but my guest today, Brad DeLong, broadly agrees. And indeed, he will give many... He will agree with many things that Galor says, and he's a very good person in explaining how Malthusian trap interacts, for example, with patriarchy. And so Galor and DeLong agree on a lot of timing, including the escape from the trap, around 150 years ago, so in the 1870s. But they disagree on what changed. Galor focused on the role of education, especially family size, which then changes the economy. DeLong flips things around. He focuses on the economy, on inventors, on corporations, on globalization, which then changes education and family, and I will let him tell you why. If you like DeLong so much that you want to hear more of him, you can head to episode 18, which is the full episode. And if you like this material more generally, do subscribe to On Humans podcast and the On Humans newsletter. On Humans newsletter you can find at onhumans.substack.com. Anyway, let's get the show started. So here is Brad DeLong on what he thinks is the biggest story of the long 20th century, and might be the biggest story in the history of our species.
Big story starting around 1870 is the end of the Malthusian era and how humanity now for the first time has to deal with the idea that we are probably going to become rich as a species. That's the big picture. That's the big story. That's the story of the long 20th century. And I suppose the bottom line, the elevator pitch summary of it is, yes, we learned how to bake a sufficiently large economic pie, something vastly in excess of what any previous century would thought could ever be needed. But the problems of slicing and tasting the pie, right, of equitably distributing it, and then using it wisely and well so that people feel safe and secure and are healthy and happy, those problems of slicing and tasting, of distribution and utilization continue to flummox us pretty much completely.
And hence we are not in the utopia.
And hence we're not in utopia. And previous people, this would struck them as rather strange because previous centuries would have seen that baking the sufficiently large economic pie is the problem.
Okay, let's zoom into that 1870. So what happens? And can you convince the critic who would say that, well, I'm sure that people were a bit richer after that than they were before that, but so they were richer after the Industrial Revolution in the 1770s, maybe.
To critics, I counterpose John Stuart Mill, who was writing in the 1870s about how all the mechanical inventions hitherto, implemented have not reduced day's toil of a single human being and have simply enabled a greater population to live the same life of drudgery and imprisonment. That really a fairly hard Malthusian line. That back before 1870, technological progress was never fast enough to deal with the grave Malthusian problem, which is that under patriarchy, about 1 woman in 3 does not have a surviving son. And if you reach the age of 50 without a surviving son in patriarchal regimes before back, then you are close to being socially dead. You have next to no social power, at all. Probably would not have been the case had we not been patriarchal, right? The chances that you're going to not have any surviving children are only 1 in 9. But the 1 in 3 chance of not having a surviving son kind of energizes people when they get extra resources to think, trying for another pregnancy or 2 would be a good thing to do. And so you have the world going from from 50 million people in the year minus 1,000 to 500 million people by 1500 to 1.3 billion by 1870. And yes, there are efflorescences. There are places where the middle class is prosperous and the working class is not scared that they're going to starve to death. Yes, there's enormous technological progress. But the 1.3 billion people alive in 1870 you have much, much smaller farm sizes than did the 50 million people arriving in the world minus 1,000. And, while the upper classes and the middle classes certainly have much more interesting and much more technologically capable lives, for the typical human being who is a peasant, it's still a very rough struggle. It's, a poor life and one in which there is always the chance that you will spend several hours a day thinking about how you really, really, really would love to have more calories right now. And it's a life in which infant mortality is extremely high, on the order of 400 per thousand. It's a life in which you are between 2 and 4 inches shorter than we are because of calcium and other nutritional deficits. And, it's a life in which things are quite hazardous and in which potentially 1 in 7 women dies in childbirth. And all of that changes, or the potential for all of that changes after 1870. And, that's the thing that potentially at least changes after 1870, that after 1870, technological progress gets rapid enough, that there's no way that population growth can keep up with it. And so people get richer, and as people get richer, children are better nourished, infant mortality falls. And then everyone looks around and says, hey, maybe the 8 pregnancies lifestyle is not the kind of thing I need to do anymore because I'm pretty confident my children will grow up. And so once you then get out of that mindset over the demographic transition, you're on your way to our present world, which looks like it will have 10 billion people rather than 1.3 billion people. Yes, the 20th century saw a huge population explosion, but zero population growth is now approaching worldwide, and our technology has vastly outstripped that. The land that supported 1 person in terms of food in 1870 now has to support 6. We can do that. And we can do that with only a very small proportion of our labor force now devoted to agriculture.
And so basically, would it be right to say that what happens in 1870 is that before that, although you have increases in technology, you also have they are matched by an increase in population. And therefore, the average person really, really doesn't have much more. I had Aurel Galor on the podcast, and he had some fascinating data on wages. And I was struck by just how little really happened.
Yeah, that 50% of your income before 1870 has to go to just 2,000 calories plus essential nutrients every day. There are very special societies, like, say, the Native Americans on the shore of San Francisco Bay who eat shellfish and have an extremely high protein and high calorie diet.
And without agriculture, right? They were hunter-gatherers.
Yeah, yeah. Or the Comanche of the Great Plains after the horses escaped from the Spanish. And after they caught the horses and learned how to do the nomadic buffalo hunting lifestyle where you hunt the buffalo with horses rather than on foot. But other than that, you very, very quickly, the patriarchal imperative that it's important to have a surviving son, pushes population up and pushes population up until you reach the stage where the population can't grow any longer. Um, and that's usually where you've reached the stage that, children's immune systems are so compromised because they're malnourished that they can be taken down by the common cold. And women are often so skinny that ovulation is hit or miss. And that's what we keep bumping up against. England certainly got very close to escaping from Malthus between 1770 and 1870. But, a bunch of that, maybe a third of English productivity growth between 1770 and 1870 comes from the great globalization ingathering of manufacturing to Britain. As it begins to export textiles and iron goods all over the world, and things that would have otherwise been produced anywhere else, mostly China and India, are instead produced in Britain. And so they have this great opportunity to move into very high value production. And maybe a third of it was due to the fact that the last round of glaciers were giant bulldozers that scraped all the rock off of the coal deposits. So, England and the Ruhr Valley, too, have these absolutely magnificent coal deposits where the coal's simply at the surface. And you pick it up and it's close to sea level, so you can then float it by water. And, those two things that made England special from 1770 to 1870 were transitory. And so there is a possible world in which things don't change from the point of view of technological revolution after 1870, and that the ingathering of manufacturing is completed, so that's no longer a source of growth. And the cheap coal is really used up, so that's no longer a source of growth. And then you have in England, where productivity is growing at maybe 0.3% per year, and a population growth rate of 0.6% per year. That would kind of offset that with respect to its effect on working class living standards.
So basically, the idea that the Industrial Revolution changes everything is not really correct, because
there is a counterfactual in which after 1870, the world settles into a kind of steampunk equilibrium.
Yes.
With productivity growth maybe a fifth or so of what we have in the world today, but with the demographic transition not yet happening, because while people are no longer living on $2.50 a day, they're living on something like $4 a day or so. And that really isn't enough without modern public health to get people feeling secure enough about their children, to move you out of the 8 pregnancies as a standard. And the world still remains extraordinarily poor. And that was a world we did escape with the Second Industrial Revolution.
So what happens in 1870?
All of a sudden, instead of coming slowly one by one, innovations start hitting the world economy with extreme rapidity. And then all of a sudden, instead of it being a huge slog, to take some piece of science or knowledge and turn it into a possible technology, and then develop that technology, and then deploy that technology, and somewhere, and then for that technology to diffuse. It's not, that there were things as important as the invention of the electric motor, or the long distance power line, or the internal combustion engine, or kind of the marvelous things German chemists did with hydrocarbons and so forth. Starting from the time of the steam engine or even before, you did have inventions as consequential, but they came along only very, very, very slowly, right? One in a century, maybe, or one in every 40 years. And then with 1870, with the Second Industrial Revolution, it comes boom, 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 boom.
In the book, you say that people invented inventing.
Yeah. My guess is what really mattered was not any one individual invention, but instead you got the system routinized. That we managed to develop the industrial research lab, to rationalize and routinize, the discovery and development of better ways of manipulating nature and organizing ourselves. And we developed the modern corporation, which rationalized and routinized, the development and deployment of technologies, and then the global market economy gives you huge incentives to deploy technologies that can be used for profitable production and deploy them worldwide. And then the fact that other people are looking over your shoulder means that they diffuse incredibly rapidly.
Because you have the invention of telegram and steamships.
Yes, yes. And all of those hit around 1870, with maybe the corporation having its origins in the U.S. experience of trying to mobilize for the Civil War at a previously unheard of scale, right? And the industrial research lab growing out of the machine tool industry and the profession of engineering as it had evolved in the first half of the 19th century. And earlier experiments, such as the United States is deciding that the Springfield Arsenal, it wasn't just a place to make weapons, but to experiment with how they could be made much more efficient. And, globalization had been coming for a while. Yeah, but all these things seem to hit around 1870, and pretty much everything turns upward. So that in 1919, looking back, John Maynard Keynes dates to 1870, the time when economic El Dorado began. When the devil of Malthus was banished and when technological progress was clearly so rapid, that there were no longer arguments about whether the working class was being immiserized or not. It was quite clear all over the world that working classes were getting a much better deal, decade by decade. And that happens in 1870.
Yeah, can I ask you, what do you think about Ored Galore's argument around this? So in our discussion and in his book Journey of Humanity, he's quite similar in many ways in what he's saying. He's also saying that humans, just there was no growth really in real wages for most of human history.
Right.
Because it was eaten by population growth.
Right. Right.
And he also traces the dramatic change towards 1870, if I remember correctly, towards the late 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
But what he says is that what changed was that the technological development hit a threshold at which education became necessary, mass education.
Yes.
And that spurs even industrialists, and actually especially industrialists, to lobby for public education, which many people find very surprising, but that apparently is well recorded, at least in Britain. And so the idea being that there isn't really anything that has to change dramatically in the rate of technology. It just reaches this kind of tipping point.
Yes.
After which it becomes necessary to educate the population, which then leads into this demographic transition, smaller family sizes, which then frees the countries of the North Atlantic from all the Malthusian forces. And then you start having growth, not growth in population, but growth in per capita income.
Yes. That Oded sees a single switch being flipped. That before 1870, the potential benefits to a parent from investing in one particular child, from sending that particular child to school, say, or having them learn a trade or so forth, were kind of small because, technology was such that there really wasn't that much to learn and it wasn't that useful. And so before 1870, families say we should invest our resources in having a bunch of children in the hopes that some will survive and they will be there as a comfort to us as an old age and as a potential source of resources to us in our old age. And we need to have many baskets, each with an egg in it. And then in 1870, somehow a switch is flipped, and all of a sudden it makes more sense for you to invest in having two children, feeding them extremely well so their brains can grow and develop, feeding them lots of milk and protein and calcium, and sending them to school, because having, one child able to work in the industrial economy of 1880 is worth more to you in terms of support in your old age than are having six, three of whom will then die. And if you can feed that one child enough, then they're almost surely not going to die. And that's what changes it. And that also changes the rate of technological progress, because all of a sudden, a lot of resources that were being devoted to having more children, almost all of whom died, were devoted instead to building up the skills, the education, the knowledge, and the brains of individuals. And so simply the accumulation of human capital was so immense, and that shows up in my schema as an increase in the pace of technological growth.
Yeah, yeah. And the beauty in the theory is that it explains pretty well the situation of countries like India, which, according to this theory, were forced into a path where you don't need to educate your people because you're just growing stuff for the British. And therefore, whilst the British per capita income is growing, well, so is the income in India, but it's just being dispersed across this growing population. So it's a neat theory. So what do you think about it?
Yeah, it's a neat story. It all fits together. I tend not to believe in the discontinuous flipping of single switches. I mean, noted you flick the switch and you flick the switch, and so you start having fewer children and investing in education. And that fact that you're no longer having as many children is what allows income to rise and infant mortality to fall, and validates the decision to invest. While in my view, it's wealth comes first, and with wealth comes first, infant mortality starts to fall. And as infant mortality starts to fall, people say, wait a minute, we don't need to have as many children. And then you get the demographic transition. And I think my story fits better because we do have this huge population explosion, right? From 700 million people in 1770 to 8 billion people today, headed for 10 billion. And so, that there are about 50 or 60 years in every country in which technology and income is advancing rapidly, but in which people have not yet made this switch from having huge numbers of children down to 2 or 3.
So what had to happen, you say, is that they had to get richer. They had to have more food on the table and more
Mhm.
security. What about engineers? I've never appreciated engineers as much as I've done after after reading the book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
When did engineering start being a thing?
Well, kind of. It really has to start in the 1740s because there has to be some guy who can fix the steam engine.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
indeed, that's what becomes. That's where
Hmm.
engineer is. The guy who knows how to fix the steam engine becomes the engineer. And then as more and more devices arrive that require someone who knows how to fix them, that word spreads out from the guy who knows how to fix the steam engine to the guy who knows how to fix all of these technological items. And then you get a bunch of them, and they start to form a community, and they then start to at least talk among themselves and train and educate themselves. And people like Nate Rosenberg or David Mowry up at our business school here would say that really it's the coming and at the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s. You have engineering as a profession, plus machine tools as an industry. That we're not just going to have tools, we're going to have specialized tools for making things that are items of technology, that's the real switch. And that once you get those, the fact that a generation and a half later, you would get the industrial research lab and the corporation is no great surprise.
Hmm.
And globalization was coming because the railroad, the telegraph cable, and the iron steamship were coming, no matter what. And so David would probably say, no, I shouldn't put 1870, I should say 1830. And I say, but, the 1830 was when the fuse was lit. And there was no way after 1830 to avoid us getting onto our wealth trajectory. That it wasn't freakish institutional inventions that happened in 1870. Instead, it was the existence of this profession of people who were in the business of technology.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The story of Nikola Tesla is really interesting. So let me try to paraphrase what I what I kind of got from reading is that he was kind of this socially awkward mad inventor.
More than socially awkward, right? But apparently the only person who could stand him was George Westinghouse, right? George Westinghouse kept paying people to accept insults from Tesla.
And so what changes? What changes when you go from humanity having always had these mad geniuses to them
Mhm.
suddenly having Tesla work?
Yeah.
for someone who pays the bills in an industrial
Yes.
research lab. What happens in that transition? Why is it so important to have that? I mean, it sounds like a pretty boring thing to say that human condition changed because of the industrial research. So why is it such a big deal?
Before 1870, if you had an idea, about something that would work, a better steam engine, say, you would have to not only be the inventor with the idea, you'd also have to be the developer and the machinist to demonstrate it. You'd then have to go out and beg for money. You'd have to find a venture capitalist. You'd have to be a financier.
You'd have to have better social skills than Nikolai Tesla.
You'd have to have huge amounts of extremely good social skills in order to
Yeah.
assemble a team that could actually make your device, and then sell it.
Yeah.
And so, it takes a great deal of time. But once 1870 comes along, Nikola Tesla can work full time on what he is better than anyone else in the world at.
Yeah.
And all of the jobs in which his productivity is actually negative can be done by other people, provided George Westinghouse is willing to apply sufficient money to keep the IRL lab going. And so he is useful. And so we get our modern alternating current electricity industry when we do, simply because George Westinghouse is there with the Westinghouse Corporation and the idea that we should have an industrial research lab like the one
Yeah.
Thomas Edison already has.
I've heard you say that before 1870, if you wanted to, most people didn't get rich. Most people lived somewhere close to the poverty line. And if you did want to be rich, the only way to do it was to run an extraction and an exploitation machine. Why?
Well, how else, right? Maybe if you have a better idea for a water pump, you can build one for yourself. But if it really is that much better a water pump, other people will look at it and will immediately copy it. And so you won't be able to sell your services as a water pumper and as a maker of water pump for very much. And in addition, if you do start a very profitable, commercial industrial enterprise, well, you then become a very soft target, in a world in which the rich are usually the judges, as well.
So when Marx writes in mid 1800s that capitalism is an extraction and exploitation machine, would you say that he's kind of right about the capitalism of the time?
Yes, property is theft. When Proudhon said it was very close to being true, right? That how would any individual actually manage without having their hooks into what is basically a force and fraud exploitation and domination regime in which thugs with spears collect taxes from the peasants and in return offer nothing useful except possibly protection from the next group of thugs with spears miles away.
And people like Westinghouse are able to not run an exploitation extraction machine, but get rich by investing in inventions that will help everyone. Is that right?
Yes.
I do appreciate the picture. I sometimes find it frustrating when people just use the term capitalism to describe everything that has happened in the money world for the past, whatever is it, 300, 500 or so years or something.
Yes,
And I
yes,
assume
yes.
that what British and East India Company is doing with guns must be the same thing as what a modern corporation
Yeah.
is doing.
And also is puzzling, right? That in Friedrich Engels, it was pretty clear. You had feudalism, and then you moved over the course of 700 years or so to capitalism. And, feudalism taught hierarchy and respect God and stay in your place. And your life is very much like of your grandparents. And, you have obligations to everyone else. And some of them have obligations to you, and society is static. And then Engels said by 1700, we moved to better technologies, craft and mercantile technologies, commercial society, in which you were probably a free person and you had to find a place in a network economy and find someone to buy things from and someone to sell things to, usually to sell your labor to. And you were an individual with rights who entered into contracts with others and was formally free, and so should probably have some say in the government as well. but that somehow the market prices at which you, if you were lower class, could trade were not very advantageous to you and you stayed poor. And, the system told you it was your fault because you weren't sufficiently industrious. But actually, that's not the case. It was that commercial society capitalism was an extraction machine, just like feudalism, but one where the extraction was kind of hidden behind the fiction that we were just trading things when the system had rigged the prices at which they were trading. And then Engels said, here we are now moving into steam power. And it's obvious that production is social, that we're all playing an essential role in something much, much bigger than ourselves. And it is that which is productive and which deserves to own what is produced, since none of us individuals are essential at all for any piece of it. And so, since we're all humans together, since we all have this incredibly complicated division of labor, since only the division of labor itself is valuable, and since we're all human, well, we should all dress in identical blue denim overalls, call each other comrade, and share things equally, and have a free society of associated producers where we rotate through the administrative jobs. Because after all, capitalism has simplified the administrative jobs so much that all you have to do to them is know how to add, subtract, multiply, divide, and issue receipts. And that was what Engels said would be the shift from feudalism to capitalism to socialism. And that it would be the form of the technology of the steam power age that would teach people that socialism was the obvious thing to do, just as it was the network commercial trading economy of the capitalist age that had taught people that, market economies and private property were the things to do. The problem is it didn't stop with steam power. The extremely large industrial working class, all doing very similar jobs side by side because you have to work near the steam engine, which is the source of power. That society then dissolved during the Second Industrial Revolution into a much more fragmented and diverse one in which different industrial interests were fighting over the surplus against each other, rather than it being that everyone was a worker subject to the steam engine or a capitalist.
And was it more diversified partially because of Tesla and electricity allowing transfer of power?
Yes, the coming of the technologies of the coming of the oil age, of the electricity age, of the chemicals age, that all of a sudden it was no longer as obvious to people that they were just one worker among many. They might be skilled workers who were in this particular industry. And so that their principal thing possibly disadvantaging them was not that the bosses were in control, but rather that their sector did not get sufficient respect. And in fact, it had a tariff adverse to it imposed on. But then from the Second Industrial Revolution economy, we moved on to the mass production economy, which is a different thing too, but which underpinned a great deal of the rise of social democracy. But then the mass production economy was succeeded by the global value chain economy, and now it looks like we're headed into the info-biotech economy. And each of these really is a different mode of production. And is one in which the workplace and the way it's organized teaches people different things about how society should and ought to work. And calling them all capitalism and saying we really all should be wearing identical blue overalls and sharing things equally and recognizing our common humanity as cogs in the production process. The lessons that Engels said steam power society was teaching, and Rose rightly saying steam power society was teaching. To align all of these things, to say steam power, Second Industrial Revolution, mass production, global value chain, and infobiotech are all just one thing called capitalism, causes a great deal of confusion. And
yeah.
They tried to solve it. People tried to solve it by talking about late capitalism. The problem is people started talking about late capitalism in 1905.
Okay. So that was part 2 of this quest to understand the birth of modern prosperity. Appreciate you listening till the very end. You can enjoy an essay version of this episode at onhumans.substack.com. Alternatively, of course, you can just sit back, enjoy the summer, and wait for the next episode in the series. in the next episode, the world's most cited economic historian Darren Asimov tries to convince me that working classes were not, as Galler and DeLong think, held back for millennia by population growth as much as the extraction of the elites, and why he thinks this changed with the rise of democracy and labor unions towards the end of 1800s. I hope you tune in to Darren Asimov in a few days, but until then, take care.